Jerry Lancaster had already told me the famous story about Chalman Beenan observing the woman praying over her food in a diner. So when Alex started to tell it to me, I was able to cut him off and get back to my work on my book. The actor Chalman Beenan was sitting in a diner in the little town of Wapshawk Falls, Florida, during a lunch break from the filming of Scrawny Prep and knocked it from my hands. He had just ordered a grilled cheese sandwich when the woman sitting at the booth across the aisle from him received her food. He was amazed to see her fold her hands beneath her chin and close her eyes in prayer. She even moved her lips slightly, mouthing the words of whatever ritual she was performing. He assumed she was asking the blessing of the Christian God on her food, but realized that she could have been praying to anything, even the food itself. "Please don't choke me, my meal." Seized by inspiration, Beenan began to write a poem, one of his most celebrated right there. A lesser man might have been forced to make use of a napkin, Alec defiantly explained to Seville, but Chalman always carried a small notebook with him for just such moments. "What was the name of the poem?" Seville asked, with a hint of boredom, I thought. "This harmony glut stands to reason." What nobody who first heard the story on the Cindy Chickenette show knew, however, was that Beenan was forced to borrow a pen as his had somehow disappeared. Maybe homegrown Malone ate it. The first people to hear "This harmony glut stands to reason" were a half-dozen members of the crew on the film Adenoidal Discovery Patch. They had gathered in Chalman Beenan's trailer to celebrate his 40th birthday. The feeling that this occasion also marked the formal beginning of the decline of Beenan's career was common among all the attendees, including the birthday boy himself. After the cancellation of the TV series based on the two-headed boxer, there was a general understanding that boxer fatigue had set in. Alec lectured us all over a cup of coffee. That is, Alec drank coffee. Seville had milk. I do not eat or drink anything containing caffeine, and Jerry, being an imaginary person, usually restricts his diet to ethereal paste. Personally, I liked the TV show. At least that's what I gather from a memory I have of asking my mother why it wasn't on the air anymore. "What'd she say?" I asked. "She said it wasn't popular," Alec remembered, and I asked her what popular meant. She said it means nobody liked it, and I said, well, I liked it. He sipped his overly sweetened drink. "But I don't actually remember any of the episodes." "They made an animated series as well," Seville pointed this out, surprising me in doing so. "Yeah, I've seen some of it," Alec nodded. "It's not very good. I'd say it's on a level with the Star Trek animated series." "That's still pretty good," I insisted. Jerry seconded this. Yes, King Coob, listening to our conversation from a hidden compartment beneath our table, rubbed his cucumber-like nose vigorously. "More Star Trek, more Leonard Nimoy," he thought frantically, and at that moment he thought of the perfect way to get me to come to his establishment. Get Leonard Nimoy himself to pay a visit to the memorial. He turned to Clouto, sitting beside his employer on an overturned milk crate. "Clouto," he hissed, "I've got it," and he told the young man of his plan. "But we've tried to get him to visit the memorial for years," Clouto pointed out. "How are you going to get him to just show up now?" "Well, not the real Leonard Nimoy, obviously," King Coob sarcastically drooled. "We'll get somebody to pretend to be him and string up a bunch of banners in Wankin saying, 'Welcome Leonard Nimoy.'" He moved his fingers through the air as he visualized the scene. "And when Todzkavod shows up, he'll see them and come immediately to my place." "How can you be sure of that?" King Coob had long ago given up on getting his employees to address him as Your Majesty and avoid the use of the common second person. "Because they'll read, 'Mr. Nimoy has to be back on the starship by blank, sometime just after Todzkavod hits town.'" "Yeah," Clouto nodded. "That might work. It had better, because I can't think of anything else." Pleat Mathras had the use of a large old house in the middle of one of the nicer residential areas in town. The town's name, which I should have told you before, was Tiny Denver. The house was owned by Flowery Braid, a member of the internationally famous band Nostrilmate. The house had been cut up into apartments, but Mathras had the run of them all. One of them he had made into a writing stronghold. He was in there now, working on a story for his book, now tentatively called Processional Ammonia Divider. The story was called The Staring You in the Face Pyramid Kit. So far, he had written. The location for the photo shoot had been chosen long in advance. Mr. Wanmaker's book outgrowth was an old bookstore of the creaky wooden floor variety. The interior was a labyrinth of shelves overflowing with books that awaited the arrival of the one person in the world that wanted them. They were like orphans that stay in the orphanage long past 18 years of age, like puppies for whom there is no gas chamber in the future should they not prove cute enough. Tiny framed photographs of obscure authors were hidden throughout the store. A map of the kingdoms of pre-1870 Germany hung over a bookcase full of long-forgotten children's book series like Tom Adventure, The Televisual Twins, and Silly Seamstress. Schneider Futterbinger, the director of marketing for Beleaguered, a mail-order clothing company specializing in the latest preppy revival, had been an avid shoplifter at Mr. Wanmaker's book outgrowth in his college years. He had wanted to use the place for some time now. It was the discovery of Nancy Burke that made up his mind. "She's perfect," he told a couple of interns. "I can't wait to see her strolling among the stacks of obscure old novels and coffee table books about stuff nobody cares about anymore." "She doesn't look old enough to be the mother of two kids," one of the interns, one whose job was secure by right of familial connections, pointed out. "They're two little kids," Futterbinger returned. His hand hovered over the floor at the height most people would associate with a portable TV in an otherwise unfurnished apartment. Nancy Burke, a skinny sophomore at the University of Lesser Colorado and member of one of its many fine sororities, had been chosen by Futterbinger to pose with two adorable blonde children in a woolen skirt and a cardigan of some complementary color. She was excited about the job, but not so excited that she allowed it to show in her face. In the photo that eventually appeared on the back cover of the fall edition of the Beleaguered catalog, she looked as though sitting on the floor of an old bookstore with two toddlers was all in a day's work for the privileged class. This dead... That was as far as Pleat had gotten when Angelica rang the bell at the front door. For King Coob and Clouto, this was a dangerous complication. "There weren't supposed to be any visitors today," Coob barked. Clouto, observing Pleat on the oscillating Detrachamber's main view screen, announced worriedly, "He's getting up. He's not happy at the intrusion, but he's going to answer the door." King Coob had no other option if he wanted to avoid detection. He ordered Clouto to cut the Detrachamber's oscillation. As the room in which Pleat had been writing moved back into phase with the rest of the house, just in time for Pleat to open the door and find not a white fog of abstraction but the usual hallway, Coob threw himself back in his chair. The oscillating Detrachamber, supported by one leg dangling through the earth's surface, was made up of two parts: the abstraction room, into which Pleat in his writing room had been voided for about half an hour, and the small control room in which Coob and Clouto sat trying to determine their next move. "If they go back into the writing room, we can start the oscillation again," Clouto offered. "And what if they decide to fuck?" Coob demanded. "They're hardly likely to do that in the writing room." "No," Clouto agreed. "They'll most likely use Mattress's mattress." King Coob flashed his tiny glassy eyes at Clouto. "You've just been waiting to say that, haven't you?" Clouto pursed his lips. He said only, "Of course, if we want to abstract the bedroom, we'll have to move the Detrachamber forward about..." He consulted a dial. 12 meters. "Damned shame, too," Coob grumbled. "I was just getting interested in this Burke girl." Could she be a substitute of some sort for the one with him now?" Clouto postulated. "I doubt it. Different social classes, different goals in life," Coob sighed. "All right, get ready the Detrachamber for God damn it. All right, ready the Detrachamber for repositioning." The horrible grinding sound of the supporting leg being scraped through the earth and reinserted disturbed several of Pleat's neighbors, but none knew what it really was. Most thought it was the latest Nostril Mate album. Chapter 5, Colonization, Fat Three-Digit Madness. Alex Spaghetti had seen the Two-Headed Boxer film so many times that he had ruined them for himself. When he was alone and in a quiet, contemplative mood, scenes from the films ran through his head with the same insistency as painful childhood memories. This wasn't quite as bad as the childhood memories, for the scenes didn't make him wince, even as they threatened to make him sick with familiarity. Alec had discovered that the best way to keep the films fresh was to share them with others. This was part of his motivation in founding the club. And now in the car he debated telling Clark Seville about one of his favorite moments from one of the films. "Clark," he would begin, "how familiar are you with the Two-Headed Boxer films?" Seville would reply, "Well, Alec, of course I've heard of them, but I have to admit that I'm not as familiar with them as I'd like to be." Really? There's a scene in the gloves of the two-headed boxer that I think sums up the essential appeal of the films in general and the character of Garlic Gibbon in specific. Would you like to hear about it? And without waiting for an answer, for obviously hearing Alec reiterate the scene was as good as it was going to get in the absence of actually being able to sit down and watch the thing, Alec would begin with a little background story, explaining how Garlic Gibbon had lost his job at the natural gas pumping station and been forced to go to work for the two-headed boxer's manager, Pen Gwyn. Ambrose pawned his gloves again, Pen Gwyn told Garlic Gibbon. The latter had only been working for the Gwyn management team for a couple of hours when he was summoned to Gwyn's office at the top of a flight of stairs in the old garage door factory. Gwyn sat behind a desk made of the front door from his mother's house atop 2 stacks of cinder blocks. Gwyn's mother was dead and the house had been hauled away to pay her bills. The door, along with a tin candy box full of buttons, were the only things Gwyn had managed to save. He sat behind the makeshift desk like a sea lion in an old-fashioned college jersey and a hat that could just as easily have been a felt version of a fireman's helmet as a derby. "You did know that the two-headed boxer's name is Imbro, didn't you?" Gwyn asked his new employee. I think I'd picked it up somewhere, Gibbon, wearing the mauve jumpsuit denoting his status in the organization, answered meekly. "All you ever see in the papers or hear on the street," Gwyn gestured with his muzzle towards the outside world, represented here by the window in his office that looked out onto the darkened, disused factory floor, "is the two-headed boxer, the two-headed boxer." He sighed heavily, stiff little whiskers quavering. "I guess the public has a hard time understanding that a two-headed man can have just one name." Gibbon nodded. "That could be the problem, yeah," he agreed politely. "Okay, well, Ambrose pawned his gloves again. I need you to go get 'em out of hock." Gwyn pulled a wad of cash from the pockets of his threadbare corduroys. He jerked a couple of bills out of the wad like a lonely woman pulling tissues from a box. That ought to be enough. "Which pawn shop?" Gibbon asked, picking up the money from the desktop and examining it. "How should I know?" Gwyn snapped. "You'll have to look around. There's only a couple in the general area that he hangs around, down on Pilsudski Street. Don't you need a claim ticket or something?" Ambrose done this so many times that we have an understanding, the pawnbrokers and I. "What's so special about these gloves? Why does it have to be this particular pair?" "Well, aside from the fact that they're lucky, they're 2 lefties, specially made. Ambrose doesn't fight without 'em." Gwyn stared for a moment at the jumpsuited talking ape now standing in profile to him. "You did realize Ambrose got 2 left hands, right?" Garlic Gibbon paused before replying. What had he gotten himself into? "I hadn't really looked," he said. "Jesus, you've seen him fight, haven't you?" Gibbon raised his brow ridge. "Nope." On his way to fulfill his assignment, Gibbon decided to visit his girlfriend, Nancy Burke. Actually, the decision had already been made. Gibbon had been waiting for the chance to sneak off to her apartment. That was one of the advantages of the job, he had explained to Nancy. "I'm not tied to a desk or a machine. I'm here and there." Now he climbed the long, narrow stairs that led to her floor. There were only 2 apartments above the 2 street-level stores in the old building. At the top of the stairs, as he fished his key out of his jumpsuit pocket, he wondered yet again at who lived behind the door opposite his girlfriend's. In this scene in the movie, the camera lingered on the neighboring apartment's doorknob after Gibbon had passed inside Nancy's door. "It's me," Gibbon shouted as soon as he was inside. "I'm in the bath," Nancy called back. The bathroom was filled with steam. Gibbon leaned against the sink. "What are you doing here?" Nancy demanded. "Aren't you supposed to be at work?" She was, like Gibbon, a talking ape, although her species was chimpanzee instead of Gibbon. She, like a few discerning audience members, wondered at Garlicer's last name. It was as if, noted one critic, a major character in a more mainstream film had been named Henry Human. For his part, Gibbon wondered what would happen if Nancy got pregnant. Would she get an abortion, or risk a child who could predict what birth defects? Nancy's rather small breasts were, along with her face and the palms of her hands, devoid of fur. At this moment, however, they were obscured by mountains of soap bubbles, and Gibbon strained to see them through the suds. I am at work," Gibbon replied. "I'm on the job even as we speak." "Oh, really? What are you supposedly doing?" Gibbon sighed. "I'm supposed to be retrieving a pair of boxing gloves from a pawn shop." "Well, shouldn't you be about your master's business?" "Master!" Gibbon snorted. The word was offensive. "You're going to get fired," Nancy warned. 10 minutes later, Gibbon was back on the job, heading for Pilsudski Street. There were far more than only a couple of pawn shops, he found. All of the proprietors, however, knew the two-headed boxer. Each of them had at one time or another had possession of the lucky gloves. Finally, Gibbon came to Ed's Reliable Pawn, the current holder. He was shocked when asked to hand over $75 in order to get the gloves back. Why does the two-headed boxer need money so bad, he wondered as the paper bag containing the gloves was passed over to him. Don't you know? Ed asked, suspicion less than successfully crossing his face. Strange how few audience members over the years have pointed out that any rival boxer could have gotten the gloves out of hock under the above-described system and thereby gained immediate advantage over the two-headed boxer. But whereas in real life Ed would likely have demanded to see some proof that Gibbon worked for Penguin at this point, he only told Gibbon the sad story of the two-headed boxer's addiction to illegal narcotics. Garlicker Gibbon wrinkled his nose as if smelling something peculiar and ominous on the wind. What had he gotten himself into? On the way back to Gwen's office, he again stopped in at his girlfriend's apartment. She was still in the bath. Isn't that water cold yet? He asked, trying to conceal his contempt for Nancy's lazy, indulgent ways. If they were ever married, he told himself, this sort of thing would soon be phased out. I filled it back up, Nancy explained. Gibbon had noticed the bubbles were gone. He definitely had noticed that. But he had put it down to their natural poppage. Determined to finish that book, eh? Nancy was reading Mobile Fungus Lumbering, a paperback thriller with a picture on the cover of a man in a suit threatening a small monkey with an upraised engine block. Yes, and if I don't get interrupted any further today, I should be done with it in time for dinner. Nancy's tone indicated that there was, or there should be, something special about tonight's dinner, but Gibbon couldn't think what it might be. Well, I just came by to show you these. Gibbon held out the paper sack containing the special boxing gloves with a snapping motion that, combined with the moisture in the air, sent the gloves through the bottom of the sack and into Nancy's bath water. Whoops, Gibbon vocalized. You got my book wet, Nancy yelled. Later, Gibbon was to remember these words and realize how stupid they were. Obviously, the pages of her book must have already been steamed throughout if a minute's exposure to her bath humidity could weaken a paper sack in such a manner. This realization on Gibbon's part was conveyed in an audible interior monologue heard while he was being chewed out for ruining the two-headed boxer's lucky gloves. Alec had just been about to describe how the two-headed boxer looked standing there while Penguin yelled at Garlicker Gibbon when Clark Seville started talking. I rode a dinosaur once, he began. His gaze was on the barely visible mountains in the distance as he said this. He said nothing more for several seconds. Alec began to wonder if he would say anything else, and also how he might use this surprising and surprisingly made statement as an introduction to a discussion of the two-headed boxer's films when Seville continued. I was in my second year with a suggestible trapezoid. I had undergone surgery to transform myself into a blonde woman. Seville said no more. Alec did not ask him to elaborate, nor did he carry out his own plan to draw Seville into a discussion of any film. They each rode in silence, staring straight ahead. However, I knew the story Seville had so tantalizingly begun. Seville had indeed once ridden a dinosaur. It was in his second year with a suggestible trapezoid. His transformation into a blonde woman was a necessary part of his assimilation into its ranks. You see, Seville had been born a bear-like creature. In order to meet the suggestible trapezoid's criteria for employment as an agent, Seville had to become human. This transformation was accomplished in stages, one of which was a blonde woman. Seville hadn't been happy about it, but such was his drive to become an agent for the trapezoid that the only sign he gave of dissatisfaction with the process was the wreckage of several training machines down in the gym. Not even his new feminine form could halt the fury of his attack on the punching bags and martial arts dummies. During his time as a woman, Seville was sent, in the guise of an inspector for the Ministry of Geologic Oddities, to a natural gas pumping station out in the countryside. Here he sat for months, pretending to fill in forms and adjusting to this strange new body he found himself in. Luckily, he kept telling himself, all of the functions of a female had not been granted him, therefore he never had to avail himself of the tampon dispenser in the women's restroom. One Wednesday, Seville sat in the tiny shack that served as the station's office, wondering idly why none of the half-dozen men regularly employed at the station seemed to have any interest in him sexually. Was it his height? His bulky upper arms? When the phone rang, Seville was alone in the office. "This is Clara Seville," he answered. "How may I help you?" "You can try being a little more alluring," a voice replied. "You've got a husky voice. You just don't know how to use it." Rankin. Seville almost wished he could send his teeth through the wires to bite the man on the other end. Almost, because in his imagination he could see no way for his teeth to return to him undamaged. "What do you want?" His tone was hostile. It was a hot day. The ancient shack was not air-conditioned. Something about the way it smelled reminded Seville of some ancient forestry department construction. Hey now, calm down, Rankin urged. I've got something for you. Two things, actually. What? Seville forced himself to relax. He disciplined his emotions. Well, let's take the second thing first. Your days as a woman are almost over. We've got the next phase of your transformation scheduled for next week. Rankin, Seville sighed heavily, still in control of himself despite the rising tide of relief. That is good news. Amazingly, he found tears filling his eyes. He took a deep breath and blotted them with a strip of gauze from an old first aid kit. Now, the first thing, the main thing. Rankin was Seville's contact with the ministry. Only he knew that Seville actually worked for the suggestible trapezoid. We've had a report of a wrinkly gum trail in the woods just to the north of the pumping station. Some college kid found it this morning. He's coming back this afternoon to get photos and document it for some class he's taking. We've enlisted the help of the local sheriff's department to block the roads to keep the kid out of there long enough for you to get in there and document it yourself. After that, you are to destroy it. Understood? Document and destroy, repeated Seville. Understood. Good man, said Rankin. He paused. Well, soon anyway. Seville growled, but with his mouth away from the receiver. He didn't like Rankin's sense of humor. I take it you want me to go immediately? Yes, of course. Go now. Get it done. Rankin gave him the approximate coordinates of the wrinkly gum trail as reported to him by his spy at the university. What do I tell the men here? Seville asked. Tell them nothing, Rankin commanded. You're an inspector with the ministry. If anyone questions your absence, threaten his job. Now get going. The connection was broken. Seville hung up the receiver, grabbed his camera and a large hat, and headed outside. There was no one about. No one saw him go stalking across the field behind the pumping station towards the woods. The day was hot. The woods were mainly pine. The smell of the pine straw brought memories of summer camp to Seville's mind. Yes, bear-like creatures do get to go to camp. All sentient beings must deal with the tedium of life in their own way. As he made his way through the woods, Seville promised himself that he would get out of the South before he died. He wanted to live someplace where wearing clothes was not a punishment. About 30 minutes after entering the woods, Seville noticed to his horror that he was menstruating. Heavily. His pants became soaked with blood and sweat. It was too late to turn back. Little good it would have done him if he had. He had no change of clothes. Besides, he must complete his assignment as quickly as possible. He continued deeper into the woods. After another 15 to 20 minutes, Seville neared the location he had been given. He approached cautiously. The sound of voices came to him as he neared a large clearing among the trees. From behind a stand of Russian olive, he watched as two young men stretched a measuring tape along the ground. The college kid was back, and he'd brought a friend. Each carried a camera on a strap about his neck. Seville knew he had no choice but to kill them. He stepped into the clearing. "Hello there," he called out. The two young men, one bearded like Allen Ginsberg, the other in glasses like that same poet, in fact, they each looked like Allen Ginsberg in his own way, gave a jump as if they were a synchronized team. "Christ, you scared me," the one in the beard said to the big blonde woman in the safari outfit. "Lady, are you okay?" the one in glasses asked, yet daring not to point at the bloody crotch of the woman's pants. "What? Oh, yes, I'm fine." Seville glanced at his problem area. He smiled as pleasantly as possible. "I just had a little accident. Should he act ditzy? Sexy?" He wished he'd take advantage of these past couple of months to explore his situation more fully instead of being so rigid and hostile. No wonder the men at the station had started calling him Dude. And that one guy was actually a little cute. No time for such thoughts. No time for them ever. "I was wondering if you could help me," Seville said, moving closer. He fumbled for words. He really hadn't planned for this. "What is it?" the youth in the glasses asked as he reeled in the measuring tape. "I have a cereal here I'd like you to try." Seville decided that anything a strange woman had to say to a young man was valid, at least for a minute or two. The two men exchanged looks. In my imagination, I see them looking like Trey Parker and Matt Stone, although you are, of course, free to picture them as you like. They won't be around much longer. Seville reached into his adventurer's bag hanging against his left hip. He pulled out a box of superhero priest breakfast cereal. "It's good. You'll like it," he promised. He was warming to his task now. He could have done an impromptu TV commercial for the stuff if he had to. "Who are you?" Matt Stone asked. He was the one with the glasses. Trey Parker, running a hand through his sweaty beard, stared at the big woman's bloodstains. Could he turn this into a story? "I work for the Church of Scientology." Seville nearly laughed as he tore open the box and drove his hand inside. "Our funding," the bearded youth, alarmed, started to shout to his companion. His words, be they warning or comfort, were never completed, for from out of the colorfully decorated box, Seville withdrew the snout of an implementosaur, a large herbivore of the late Triassic. Once exposed to the light, the snout only grew in size, leading the rest of the creature's body into the clearing, which it quickly dominated. The two men staggered back, stepping on part of the wrinkly gum trail and damaging it. While they were temporarily stunned, Seville established control over the implementosaurus by means of a thought band that he'd slipped around his head. This was connected to the creature through a transmitter spike driven deep into its rectum. Seville clambered up the stairs genetically engineered into the big beast's ribcage and took his place astride its neck. From there it was a simple matter of directing the dinosaur to trample the two young men. Seville retrieved their camera and notes. The wrinkly gum trail was consumed by the implementosaurus at Seville's urging. This sickened the animal to the point of death, but Seville was able to keep it moving long enough to get it into a small pond on the other side of the woods. Beneath the water he hid its carcass as well as the carcasses of the two university students. As the ripples in the water subsided, one could see the reflection of the moon on the surface of the little pond. At that very moment, homegrown Malone was making his way to that same moon, his old knapsack laden with highly potent cannabis. The day of ritual festivities is tomorrow, Malone explained to a fellow passenger on the Escaliner Coastal Ember. Yes, I know, replied the old lady. I've been to the moon before. I don't normally make deliveries, Malone continued, but the request was so sincere I couldn't resist. Are you a native of the moon? The old lady asked. Years of garden activities had left her face and arms as wrinkly as a trail of dried gum paste. She scanned Homegrown's face with a lack of self-consciousness that Malone hadn't experienced since a class of kindergartners had paid him a visit the previous fall. Ah, you mean my warthog-like visage, Malone laughed. No, I'm from Earth. Oh, no, I didn't mean, the old lady hastened to reassure the bristly, large-snouted dealer. It's just that you look a little like Ron Perlman, so naturally I assumed you must be from the moon or Mars or someplace. Mention of Ron Perlman cast Malone into a pleasant reverie that lasted until the ship had landed. He and all the other passengers had exited the ship, and he was on his way to Plowmore in a cab. What you thinking about, buddy? The driver asked Malone. Killing Tom Cruise, Malone answered dreamily. Homegrown Malone hadn't just been asked to deliver a knapsack of pot to a needy person on the moon. He had been asked to present the pot in keeping with the spirit of the day of ritual festivities. Therefore, Malone asked the driver if he minded his changing into a costume as they drove. Do what you like, the driver told him. We don't have hang-ups about nudity here like they do on Earth. Malone's costume was that of Comptroller Tachyon, sworn enemy of Garlicker Gibbon in the fourth film of the Two-Headed Boxer series, Roundabout the Two-Headed Boxer. When he got it on, the driver looked back at him. In all honesty, except for the hat, he couldn't tell much difference, but he didn't say anything. He wanted a good tip. Malone's destination was one of the thousands of identical residential units on the outskirts of Plowmore, an artificial agriculture center. He paid the driver, gave him not only a tip, but a small tract describing the marijuana method to salvation, and started up the narrow concrete path to domicile number 1765, Red Tractor Way. In response to his ringing of the bell, the door was opened by a woman who looked like a Joni Mitchell that never made it in any branch of the entertainment world and had been forced to work in the food services industry. Who are you supposed to be, Bad Joni asked, equally amused and wary. I'm Homegrown Malone, here with Holiday Cheer. Malone held an imaginary joint between thumb and forefinger and toked on it. What? Oh, yeah, right. Joni nodded vigorously. Come on in. Didn't expect you so soon. But that's okay, Tommy's here. Now look, I want it to be a surprise. She directed Malone to the living room. You wait here. I'll go get Tommy. When he comes in, you say, hey, happy ritual festivities, okay? Got it. Malone lowered his knapsack to the floor. You want me to hand him everything at once? Yeah, that sounds good. She paused at the door to the rear of the dwelling. By the way, did you bring a bong? Sorry. Malone frowned as much as he was able through the mask. The woman returned several minutes later with a surly youth of about 15, who, on taking one look at the uniformed gorilla in the living room, screamed and retreated. Clayton Mathis read the above story aloud to his friends, Botch and Mercedes. His version was full of digressions that hopefully established a logical reason why the boy was so terrified of gorillas and why no marijuana was available on a full moon full of nudists. Botch and Mercedes, who found the story uninteresting, smiled politely throughout its length and then laughed with what they considered appropriate heartiness at its conclusion. Pleat, however, seemed to find their laughter a poor response, indicative of a failure of communication. Of course, he wasn't an ass about it. He only nodded, closed his notebook, and inquired after Hith, the dog that had mysteriously taken up residence with Botch and Mercedes a couple of months earlier. I say mysteriously because the dog, while having the face of a human and the power of speech, would say nothing of its history or intentions, only that its name was Hith, and that payment was forthcoming, among other non-sequiturs. Botch and Mercedes had accepted the dog's presence in much the same spirit as the man accepted the lion in the story of Christoph Meckel. He would come and go as he pleased, and Hith often did, sometimes returning with bizarre tokens of his affection. In answer to Pleat's query, Mercedes brought one of these out, a miniature cabinet, colorfully painted and covered with little doors, behind each of which stood a tiny vase. "Where did he get it?" Pleat wondered, turning the artifact over in his hands. "No idea," Mercedes answered. She, like Botch, her husband, was of Germanic origin. Their accents evidenced this. "He just came home with it one day." She had no qualms now about using the term home in conjunction with the dog. "Funny there's no tooth marks on it," Pleat remarked as he looked closely at the marvelous miniature. He looked up at his friends. "I assume he did bring it home in his mouth." "Oh, yes," Botch answered, "but he had it wrapped in a leather rag." "A leather rag," Pleat repeated. "I don't think his teeth would have made that much damage anyway," Mercedes added. "They are like human teeth." "Have you ever tried following him?" Pleat asked. He set the cabinet down on the coffee table before him. "Yes, but—" Botch began, but was stopped by Mercedes. She nodded towards the door. Through one of the tall windows that stood to either side of the door, one could see Hith approaching. He turned the knob with a special apparatus installed for just this purpose and entered. After shutting the door behind him, he turned and stared at the three people. "Hith!" Mercedes called his name. "Do you remember Pleat Mathras?" Pleat had met the dog on one previous occasion. "Pleat Mathras," the dog repeated. The voice was rough and monotonous. He sounded like the man in the old Red Band flour commercial, on the verge of drooling.